Some killed dozens, others left entire cities haunted, but they all met the same end, strapped to a gurney or faced with the barrel of a gun. These are the most lethal prisoners ever executed in the U.S. Men and women whose body counts were staggering, whose crimes defied comprehension, and whose final words still chill the air long after they're gone. If true crime fascinates you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss a story this intense. Let's get into it. Ever to emerge from the American South. Born in South Carolina in 1933, he was small in stature, standing just over 5 feet tall, but his size earned him a nickname that masked a much darker reality. Behind the nickname Pee-wee was a man capable of monstrous acts. Throughout his life, Gaskins claimed to have killed more than 100 people, though authorities were only able to confirm 13 of those murders. His actual kill count remains a matter of speculation, but the gruesome details of the crimes he did confess to were more than enough to mark him as one of the deadliest serial killers in U.S. history. Gaskins' trail of violence stretched from the late 1950s through the 1980s. He targeted hitchhikers, young women, people he considered disposable, and even his own acquaintances. He had a particular craving for power and control, often torturing his victims before killing them. Some were mutilated, others buried in what he referred to as his private cemetery in rural South Carolina. Gaskins bragged about his crimes with sickening pride and described himself as someone who had an itch for killing that couldn't be satisfied. Authorities believe he may have killed far more than what was proven based on his detailed confessions and corroborated findings in remote burial sites. Even after he was caught and sentenced to death, Gaskins refused to stop killing. In 1982, while on death row at the Central Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina, he carried out one of the most chilling murders in prison history. Gaskins murdered fellow death row inmate Rudolph Tyner by crafting a makeshift bomb inside a portable radio. He tricked Tyner into putting the device to his ear and then detonated it remotely using a wire from his own cell. The blast killed Tyner instantly. Gaskins had been hired by another inmate who wanted Tyner dead for murdering his parents during a robbery, and Gaskins executed the hit with shocking ingenuity. This act not only sealed his legacy as one of the deadliest prisoners, but also showed that no cell could contain his lethal ambition. When the time came for his own execution, Gaskins didn't request a lavish last meal. He asked only for a single apple. It was a strangely quiet choice for a man whose crimes had been defined by brutality and excess. On September 6, 1991, he was strapped to the electric chair, the same method of execution he had once mocked in interviews. Before the switch was thrown, his final words were simple and unemotional. "I'm ready to go." And just like that, South Carolina's most prolific killer was gone, taking with him many secrets and possibly the identities of victims never found. John Wayne Gacy, Illinois. John Wayne Gacy was not the kind of monster you'd expect. He didn't lurk in shadows or roam dark alleys. Instead, he lived in plain sight, in a modest Chicago suburb, posing as a model citizen. He ran a successful construction business. He hosted neighborhood barbecues. He even dressed up as Pogo the Clown to entertain children at hospitals and community events. But behind that painted smile lay something truly horrifying. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy committed one of the most brutal serial killing sprees in American history. His victims, 33 confirmed in total, were all young men and teenage boys. He targeted the vulnerable, runaways, troubled youths, or those simply looking for work. He offered them jobs, a quick buck, or a bit of fun. And once inside his house, they were never seen again. Gacy's method was chilling in its simplicity. He'd perform a so-called magic trick, handcuffing himself and then showing how easily he could escape. Then he'd turn the tables. He'd snap the cuffs onto his victim and whisper with eerie finality, "Now the trick is, you have to get out." Few ever did. He tortured them, he raped them, and then he killed them, often slowly, methodically. Their bodies, most were buried in the crawl space beneath his house. When that space filled up, he discarded others in the nearby Des Plaines River. The smell of decay eventually gave him away. It was the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Peist that finally brought Gacy down. The teen had gone to meet Gacy about a potential job and vanished. Police began to circle in, and when they searched Gacy's home, the nightmare fully unfolded. Beneath the floorboards, layer after layer of human remains, bones, clothing, faces of boys who had simply disappeared. Even as the evidence mounted, Gacy showed no real remorse. He insisted he was innocent, that he was being framed, but the truth was undeniable. In court, he was convicted of 33 murders, the most by a single person in U.S. history at the time. On the night before his execution, Gacy ordered a meal as grotesquely American as his double life: fried chicken, fried shrimp, French fries, and fresh strawberries. It was a feast he ate alone, in silence. And on May 10th, 1994, at Stateville Correctional Center, John Wayne Gacy was strapped to a gurney and administered a lethal injection. When asked for final words, he looked at his executioners with icy defiance and muttered, "Kiss my ass." No apology, no confession, just arrogance to the very end. His house was eventually demolished, the crawl space filled, but the legend of the killer clown still casts a long shadow, a haunting reminder that evil doesn't always hide. Sometimes it smiles at you through a layer of white grease paint. Ted Bundy. Florida Ted Bundy was the kind of man who didn't look like a killer. He was clean-cut, articulate, and charismatic, traits that helped him blend into crowds, earn trust, and lure in his victims without raising alarm. But beneath the surface, behind the polite smile and intelligent eyes, was one of the most cold-blooded predators in American history. Bundy operated like a phantom through the 1970s. He targeted young women, college students, often brunettes with parted hair, across at least 7 states. He approached them in broad daylight, usually feigning an injury or asking for help. A cast on the arm, a limp, a crutch. Once he had their trust, he would lead them to a secluded spot and unleash unspeakable violence. Kidnapping, rape, brutality, and murder. His victims often vanished without a trace. Their stories cut short by a man who looked like he could have been the boy next door. He confessed to killing more than 30 women. The real number may never be known. Bundy was also a master manipulator and an escape artist. In 1977, he broke out of a Colorado jail by climbing through a light fixture in the ceiling. Weeks later, he escaped again, this time fleeing to Florida under a false name. It was there that he committed some of his most savage murders, including the infamous Chi Omega sorority house attack at Florida State University. In less than 15 minutes, he assaulted 4 women, killing 2 of them, and vanished into the night. His final victim was 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. He abducted her from a schoolyard in broad daylight. Her body was found weeks later in a shed, far from where she was taken. Bundy's arrest came in 1978. He was caught by a Florida Highway Patrol officer after a traffic stop. What followed was a circus of trials, national headlines, and a courtroom spectacle in which Bundy, ever the narcissist, chose to represent himself. He smiled, he charmed reporters, he flirted with witnesses, but in the end, the evidence was overwhelming. He was sentenced to death in 1979. As execution day approached, Bundy tried to delay the inevitable. He gave interviews, he hinted at hidden victims, he offered to help solve old cases if it meant buying more time. But time ran out. He declined a special last meal and was instead given the standard fare: steak, eggs, toast, and hash browns. On the morning of January 24, 1989, he was led to the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Reporters and protesters gathered outside. Some cheered, others held candles. Inside, Bundy gave one final statement: "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." Moments later, with the flick of a switch, it was over. Ted Bundy died in the same state where he had committed some of his most horrific crimes. His name has since become synonymous with the term serial killer, not just for the lives he took, but for the unsettling way he concealed the monster within. Aileen Wuornos, Florida. Aileen Wuornos was unlike most serial killers America had seen. A woman with a weathered face, a tragic past, and a fury that seemed to burn just beneath the surface. Her life was a storm from the beginning, abandoned, abused, and living on the fringes of society from a young age. She turned to sex work as a teenager, drifting along the highways of Florida, offering rides and companionship in exchange for survival. But by the late 1980s, something inside her snapped. Between 1989 and 1990, Wuornos shot and killed 7 men. She claimed each one had tried to rape her, that it was self-defense, that she was protecting herself in a brutal world where no one else ever had. But the stories didn't always match. The killings were violent. Some of the victims were shot multiple times, and not all of them had criminal histories. Investigators began to doubt her version of events. The media was captivated. A female serial killer, a sex worker, a drifter, a woman who called herself a victim but had become the predator. Her case became a twisted spectacle, and soon her name was known nationwide. Wuornos was arrested in January 1991 at a biker bar in Volusia County. It didn't take long for her to confess, though the reasons shifted with time. Sometimes she spoke with rage, other times with regret, often with the kind of chaotic energy that left even seasoned detectives unsettled. Her trial was swift. The jury found her guilty of the murder of Richard Mallory, her first known victim, and sentenced her to death. Over the next year, she received 5 additional death sentences for the other murders. On death row, Wuornos became increasingly erratic. She ranted about government conspiracies, about the prison abusing her, about being tortured by mind control. She often refused visitors, speaking only to a handful of journalists and her adopted mother, a woman who had reached out to her during the trial. When the day of her execution arrived, she declined a last meal. All she wanted was a simple cup of coffee. And then came the final moment. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was strapped to a gurney at Florida State Prison. When asked for her last words, she didn't offer an apology. She didn't weep. Instead, she looked ahead and said, "I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus June 6, like the movie Big Mothership and all." Seconds later, the drugs flowed, her eyes closed, and she was gone. Aileen Wuornos remains one of the most controversial figures in American criminal history. Some saw her as a cold-blooded killer. Others saw her as a product of abuse, neglect, and violence. But one thing is certain. Her story, like her final words, left a mark that still lingers. Gary Gilmore. Utah, Gary Gilmore wasn't the most prolific killer, nor the most cunning. But he became one of the most significant names in American criminal justice. Not for how many lives he took, but for how he demanded his own life be taken. In 1976, Gilmore murdered 2 men in cold blood during separate armed robberies in Utah. The victims were a gas station attendant and a motel manager, both killed without warning, shot in the head. The crimes were brutal, dealt senseless, and seemingly motivated by little more than impulse and rage. Gilmore, a lifelong drifter with a long history of theft and assault, had only recently been released from prison before going on his final spree. But it was what happened after his arrest that thrust him into the national spotlight. In a time when death sentences were routinely delayed or overturned, Gilmore did something few expected. He refused to fight. He wanted to die. He actively rejected appeals, fired his legal team, and told the courts to get on with it. "This is my life, and this is my death," he told a judge. "It's been sanctioned by the courts that I die, and I accept that." His demand shocked the public and triggered a national conversation about capital punishment, free will, and whether the state should honor a prisoner's wish to be executed. The Supreme Court had reinstated the death penalty in 1976, and Gilmore became the first to face it. On the night before his execution, he requested a final meal of steak, potatoes, milk, and coffee. Nothing flashy, nothing symbolic, just a man awaiting his end. January 17, 1977. As the morning light crept over Utah State Prison, Gary Gilmore was strapped to a chair in a small, enclosed courtyard. A black hood was placed over his head. A white target was pinned to his chest. 5 riflemen stood behind a curtain, one with a blank round, so no one would know for sure who fired the fatal shot. When asked if he had any final words, Gilmore replied simply, "Let's do it." Seconds later, the rifles fired. The bullets hit their mark. And with that, Gary Gilmore was dead. His death marked the return of executions in America. It inspired books, films, and debate, and strangely, his final words lived on in pop culture. Years later, they would be reworked into a global slogan by Nike: "Just do it." Gilmore's life was troubled, violent, and short, but in death, he became something else entirely, a symbol, a flashpoint, in the face of a system rebooted by his own insistence. Richard Ramirez. California, Richard Ramirez, better known by the name that haunted a generation, the Night Stalker, was the living embodiment of terror in 1980s California. He struck without warning, without pattern, and without mercy. Night after night, he crept through open windows and unlocked doors, turning quiet suburban homes into scenes of unspeakable horror. His crimes weren't just murders. They were rituals soaked in cruelty, fear, and evil. Between 1984 and 1985, Ramirez embarked on a spree of violence that left at least 13 people dead. But it wasn't just the number of victims that shocked the public. It was the sheer savagery. Men, women, and even children were targeted. Some were shot, others were bludgeoned, some were sexually assaulted and then killed. Others were left alive but deeply scarred, both physically and mentally. Ramirez often left behind symbols, pentagrams scrawled on walls or etched into skin, feeding the public's belief that he was no ordinary killer. He spoke of Satan openly, claimed allegiance to darkness, and smiled through bloodied teeth in his mugshot. As fear gripped Los Angeles, residents began locking their windows, buying guns, and sleeping with lights on. No one felt safe. He struck in poor neighborhoods and wealthy ones. He chose victims young and old, and he seemed to vanish after each crime, leaving police chasing shadows. But it was a fingerprint lifted from a stolen car that finally broke the case open. Ramirez's capture was dramatic. Recognized by a group of civilians in East LA, he was chased down, beaten, and held until police arrived. He had no weapons on him, just wild eyes and that same chilling smirk. In court, Ramirez showed no remorse. He flashed a pentagram drawn on his palm. He shouted to reporters, "Hail Satan!" His trial was chaotic and long, filled with chilling testimony and disturbing evidence. Ultimately, he was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin's death row. But the execution never came. For more than 2 decades, Ramirez sat behind bars. Appeals dragged on. Public fascination grew. He received fan mail, some from admirers who called themselves devil's brides. In 2013, before his sentence could be carried out, he died of complications from B-cell lymphoma at the age of 53. Even in death, his words left a chill. "Big deal," he reportedly said. "Death always went with the territory. I'll see you in Disneyland." It was classic Ramirez, mocking, cryptic, and unapologetically dark. A final taunt from a man who once turned California's nights into a waking nightmare. Carl Panzram. Kansas Carl Panzram may be the most unapologetic killer America has ever known. A man so consumed by rage and hatred that he openly admitted to murdering 21 people and raping over 1,000 men and boys without the slightest hint of remorse. He didn't just confess, he bragged. He wrote it all down in detail, declaring himself the enemy of humanity. Born in 1891, Panzram's life was brutal from the beginning. He was beaten, abandoned, and sent to reform schools that were more like prisons. Any flicker of kindness was stamped out early, and in its place grew a deep, burning hatred for everyone and everything. By his teenage years, he was already committing burglaries and assaults. By his 20s, he was drifting across the U.S. and beyond, stealing, killing, and destroying as he went, simply because he wanted to. Panzram's crimes stretched across continents. He admitted to shooting sailors in Africa, strangling boys in the Pacific Northwest, setting buildings on fire just to watch them burn. He stole yachts, broke out of prison, and once even murdered a man with a rock for trying to befriend him. There was no pattern, no clear motive, just violence for violence's sake. He saw kindness as weakness and mercy as a joke. When he was finally arrested and imprisoned at Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas, Panzram made his intentions clear. He had no interest in rehabilitation. He wanted to die, and fast. In 1929, he killed a prison worker with an iron bar just to guarantee a death sentence. When lawyers tried to appeal on his behalf, he lashed out, refusing all help. He wanted the rope, and he wanted it now. On the day of his execution, September 5th, 1930, Panzram stood on the gallows with a sneer. The hangman fumbled with the noose, trying to position it correctly. That's when Panzram delivered his infamous final words. "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard! I could hang a dozen men while you're fooling around." And then, with the pull of a lever, he dropped. There was no apology, No closure. Just a man who hated the world and left it exactly the same way he lived in it, defiant, cruel, and entirely unrepentant. To this day, Carl Panzram remains a symbol of raw, unchecked evil, a reminder that some men don't seek redemption, only destruction. Kenneth McDuff. Texas. Kenneth McDuff's name is etched into American criminal history not just for the brutality of his crimes, but for the haunting fact that he was given a second chance and used it to kill again. His story is one of failure, not just personal failure, but systemic failure, the kind that cost innocent lives. In 1966, McDuff committed a crime so grotesque it shocked the state of Texas. He and an accomplice abducted 3 teenagers from a drive-in parking lot. 2 boys were shot execution style. The girl, 16-year-old Edna Sullivan, was raped, tortured, and strangled with a broomstick, earning McDuff the grim nickname the Broomstick Killer. He was quickly convicted and sentenced to death. For a moment, justice seemed swift and certain, but the tides of American justice shifted. In 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court temporarily struck down the death penalty, forcing states to convert death sentences into life imprisonment. And in the chaos that followed, McDuff became eligible for parole. Despite his violent past, a corrupt and overwhelmed parole system approved his release in 1989. That decision would prove fatal. Once free, McDuff wasted no time. He changed identities, drifted from town to town, and began killing again, targeting women who were vulnerable and alone. He was suspected of abducting and murdering at least 9 more victims after his release, possibly more. The bodies began turning up along highways, in ditches, and abandoned lots across Texas. Many of his victims were young women involved in sex work or living on the margins of society. Authorities eventually caught up to him in 1992 after a massive manhunt. He was charged, tried, and this time sentenced to die, for real. On November 17, 1998, Kenneth McDuff was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. Before the execution, he requested a last meal of hamburgers, French fries, and a Dr. Pepper, a final nod to a life lived without conscience or care. When asked for any last words, he said, "I'm ready to be released. Release me." And then, just like that, he was gone. But the damage he left behind wasn't so easily erased. McDuff's case triggered widespread reforms in the Texas parole system, sparking a public outcry that forever changed how violent offenders are evaluated for release. For many, he remains a haunting example of what happens when the system makes the wrong bet on mercy. Albert Fish. Albert Fish was a monster cloaked in the skin of a frail, elderly man. With sunken eyes, a gentle voice, and the appearance of a quiet grandfather, few would have guessed the horror he carried within. But behind that unassuming facade lived one of the most disturbing killers in American history, a sadist, a cannibal, and a predator whose crimes still horrify nearly a century later. Active in the early 20th century, Fish targeted the most vulnerable victims of all, children. He would often pose as a harmless old man, gaining the trust of the families and luring children away with offers of work, candy, or promises of fun. But what followed was a level of cruelty that defied comprehension. Torture, mutilation, and in some cases, cannibalism. Fish didn't just kill his victims, he derived pleasure from their pain, often writing about it in gruesome detail afterward. His most infamous crime was the 1928 abduction and murder of 10-year-old Grace Budd. Fish had posed as a prospective employer offering Grace's older brother a job. Instead, he charmed the Budd family and convinced them to let Grace accompany him to a fictional birthday party. She never returned. Years later, Fish sent the Budds a letter, one of the most chilling ever received by a victim's family, describing in grotesque detail how he had killed and eaten their daughter. The letter was so disturbing that parts of it were never released to the public. What made Fish even more terrifying was that he seemed utterly detached from reality. He believed he was following the commands of God. That pain was a form of salvation. He inserted needles into his body for pleasure. He self-mutilated. He welcomed suffering and inflicted it with glee. By the time he was caught, he confessed to killing several children and assaulting countless others. Authorities believe his true victim count may never be known. Fish was convicted in 1935 and sentenced to death by electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in New York. The trial had been a spectacle. Jurors wept. Even hardened lawmen struggled to stomach the evidence. Yet Fish, ever calm, welcomed his fate. For his final meal, he requested a raw hamburger and a side of raw carrots, an odd, almost defiant choice from a man who once consumed human flesh. As he was led to the electric chair, Fish turned to the guards and in a strange moment of irony said, "I don't even know why I'm here." On January 16, 1936, the switch was thrown, and Albert Fish was finally silenced, but the shadows of his crimes linger. His case remains one of the darkest in American history, a reminder that sometimes evil wears the mask of the ordinary, and sometimes monsters don't live under the bed. They knock on the door and smile.